Would you pray with me, please? Most holy and awesome God, we thank you that you have brought us together this evening. Holy One, we will speak in our prayers later. Those who have lost loved ones and those who have lost their lives in the world this day. But we ask right now, as we move through our service, that you just hear the beating of our hearts and see it as a prayer for those who need your touch. And here in this place, we crave your presence. We crave your touch upon us. That amazing presence that moves within us and quickens us and draws us into your life anew, reminds us that we have a home in you. That your heart is open, that it accepts and loves each and every one of us. Bless our time together this night, we ask. In your holy name. Amen. I met Ron at the shelter in New York. He was a really sweet kid. He was a 5'4" little furball. He kind of reminded me of a little friendly Ewok, if you know what one of those is. And I have his permission to talk about him, by the way, just in case you think I'm... But I remember that, especially when he was young, he so wanted to be the tough guy. You know, he had that fiery zeal that comes, I think, quite often with being shorter than average. It's kind of like a Napoleon complex. And Ron definitely had it. And he came to Sylvia's place, which was the emergency youth shelter that was being run by MCC New York, because a couple of his friends were there, and he was constantly being picked on at the Catholic shelter where he'd been staying. When he slept on the street, he was always getting beaten up for being gay, which was kind of ironic, because actually he wasn't gay. He was straight, or he was maybe bi. But in reality, you know, your sexuality doesn't matter when somebody labels you, because you suffer anyway. So after a few months of saving up, working as a messenger, doing what he could to make a fast buck in Manhattan, he had enough for a deposit on a small flat. And he connected with one of the other shelter users who had also been saving up, and they got this place together. And I remember he was just absolutely thrilled. He got a new girlfriend, and everything seemed to be on the up and up. But one afternoon, he was in Central Park with his girlfriend, and a group of skateboarders went by. And one of them yelled to him, "Oi, faggot!" And Ron being Ron, he shouted something disparagingly back at them. And the next thing, one of the kids threw a skateboard at him, and it hit him in the head. So Ron was in a coma for 3 months. And then it took him another 6 months just to be able to function and get his speech back. I'd started to leave by the time he came out of hospital. We went down to Maryland for my first solo pastorate, but I remember, moved back into the shelter because there were people there that knew him and people that could look out for him. And when Chris and I went to New York for Pride, at the following June, he was standing outside of the church as we walked down 36th Street. And I saw him standing outside, and suddenly he just ran full pelt at me and just threw himself into my arms. And he had this huge scar from the skateboard that started here and went all the way around the back of his head, and it was just enormous. And I could see that something that I'd known of Ron had gone, something was not right. And he said to me, he let go of me, he looked at me and said, "I don't know who you are." He said, "I know that I know you, and I know that you're important to me, but I don't remember who you are." And I can't think about Ron without starting to fill up, because I feel sad and I feel angry. I feel sad that he lost so much, and I feel angry because of the injustice of it all. And the one thing that Ron had going for him in his recovery was MCC Shelter, which was Sylvia's place. Because it wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a place where he could be safe. He could be himself. And he knew that others had his back there. I heard that even after he'd left, he would go back and support people who were there at the shelter. Now, today, there are 3 shelters, and there's a drop-in centre, and there's also Reverend Pat's Finishing School, which is a ministry that helps young trans people with the practicalities of transitioning in the US. So helping with housing, dealing with work issues, giving support as they navigate the health system, dealing with, for MTF, dealing with makeup and walking and voice and all of these things. It's a family. There are folks that have your back, that look out for you and support you. But in return, of course, you have to have their back, look out for them and support them. If you think the only way to get ahead is to put others down, or the only way for you to win at life is for somebody else to lose, then it's not going to be an environment that you'd appreciate or that you'd enjoy. How can you look after number one only and then take the whole notion of family seriously? Because as soon as you take advantage of someone, you've shown that you don't value them. And the feeling of family is lost. And at the shelter, the feeling of family was really important. You know, you might not like the person who's sleeping in the next bed, especially if they snore, but they're in the same situation as you, and everybody needs a little help at some point or another. Here at the Village MCC, our goal is the same, to create a space where everyone feels safe, supported, and cared for. A place that we can call a spiritual home, a family. And that's really not easy, because it means taking care of the person on your left and taking care of the person on your right. Which is easy if you like them. And it's easy if you already love them. But when they get on your nerves, when they don't believe the same that you do, when their priorities are different, their goals and ambitions are different, when they say things that you think are inappropriate, or they just plain get on your nerves, then it's not easy. A church, a community, I think is just a large family. And I believe that a family is not a group of people that are all the same. It's a group of people that are all committed to taking care of each other and protecting each other. And as a church rooted in the LGBT community, serving the LGBT community, it's up to us to be aware of not just what affects us as individuals or as a church or as a community locally, but what affects our brothers and sisters in the larger community around the world. There was a story about a youngster that went to the mother and said, "Mum, where do people come from?" And the mother said, "Well, in the beginning there was God, and God made Adam and Eve had children, and they had children, and they had children, and eventually the whole world filled up, and that's where all the people came from." "Oh," they said. So then they went to ask their dad, where do people come from?" Dad said, "Well, you know, the evolutionary process has not been an easy one for life on this planet. And effectively, we started off in the oceans, gravitated to the land. There was the rise of mammals and eventually apes. And from apes, different branches emerged, one of which was human beings." The little one scratched their head and said, "So you mean we come from chimpanzees?" And the father said, "Well, yeah, kind of." So I went back to the mum and said, "You lied. Daddy said that we come from chimpanzees." And the mother said, "Oh, that's okay, dear. That's just his side of the family." Do you ever watch Countdown? Well, I have it on the background sometimes. And on Thursday, Susie Dent was explaining the root of the phrase hue and cry. You know the phrase hue and cry? Apparently, it's a practice that dates back to Anglo-Saxon times.
Baby.
When it was discovered that a crime had been committed in the community, if a house had been robbed, for example, then the person who discovered it would make as much noise as they possibly could. A hue and cry. They'd shout, bang pans, ring bells, anything to get the attention of neighbours and the district soldiers, who would quickly do the same until everybody knew what was happening. The villagers and soldiers would immediately get together, gather as a posse, and track the criminal down, making it impossible for a thief to get away. And it was called the hue and cry of the 100. That's where the phrase comes from. Now, an Anglo-Saxon district had at least 100 soldiers. If a crime was committed in the community and the perpetrator wasn't caught, then the 100 had to cover up compensation. So you can imagine they were very well motivated to catch the thief. Now, this system started with the Romans, which is why the Romans were called centurions, from century, which means 100, as in the cry of the 100. But it also, oddly enough, means tribe or company. And as part of a queer tribe, I believe that it's up to us to create a hue and cry about the injustices that are perpetrated against our community. Not just here in the church, although that's important, but in the wider LGBT community. Did you know, here's the facts, there are currently 247 countries or dependent territories in the world. China has the largest population with 1,369,420,000 people, give or take. And the Pitcairn Islands in the Pacific has the smallest population with 57. Mm-hmm. There are 78 countries where same-sex acts are actually illegal. In India, Uganda, Nigeria, and more recently Gambia, the situation has gotten worse with the passing of new anti-gay laws and harsher sentences. This January, Gambia's president, Yahya Jammeh, I said that right? Yahya Jammeh, said, Earth is doomed because of gays. I think that's really doomed because of gays. He also said you can cure AIDS with herbs and bananas. Who knew? In a speech condemning same-sex relationships, he said the US and other countries that sponsor the LGBT people are leading the collapse of modern society as we know it. There was a 5-year sentence there for cross-dressing, 14 years if you're found to be LGBT. Not caught in an act, just found to be lesbian, gay, bi, trans. There are 5 countries that we know of: Iran, Mauritania, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, as well as some parts of Nigeria and Somalia that punish same-sex acts with the death sentence. There are a further 4 countries where it's not entirely clear whether the Sharia code, which stipulates the death penalty being used, is actually being carried out. They are Brunei Darussalam, Iraq, Pakistan, and Qatar. In the last 2 years, 9 countries, including Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Tanzania, have either passed law or have parliaments who are looking at bills regarding so-called homosexual propaganda laws. Just prior to this, Russia came out with one. You've probably heard about it. However, there's some good news in that Moldova, Hungary, and Armenia rejected such bills. Incitement of hatred based on sexual orientation, in other words, it's a hate crime to incite people to hate people who are LGBTQI, is only against the law in 28 countries. That's 28 out of 247. If you listen to the BBC interview that I emailed out earlier this week, then you'll understand how desperate the situation is in places like Iran and Russia. Homophobic attacks are not just common, they're institutionalized. Murder is common and the suicide rate is just astronomical. Thanks to the Global Justice Institute and Reverend Boone's work, we now have 11 LGBTQ fellowship groups in 10 major cities around China, and are sponsoring a leadership retreat in China this year. We've already had 100 young people register for that. This year, we go to Vietnam for the first time. In Kenya, we started a pastors' church leaders group, which teaches pastors how to talk about marginalized and institutionalized peoples, including, obviously, LGBT people and people living with AIDS. Forget trying to teach churches to accept LGBT people. Forget that. Right now, we just want to stop the killing. And that starts with the messages that churches send out to their people. So that's the area in which we're working. We're not looking for acceptance, we just want to stop the killing. Also, in Kenya, we're developing a partnership that's looking at the first Global Justice Institute satellite centre outside the US, and we've already got the land for that. In Costa Rica, we're working on a partnership with Casa Abierta, which is a refugee ministry for Central Americans. In Jamaica, we are working to support the LGBT community there, provide a safe space for meeting and lobby against the violence and killings. We're looking to provide safe houses in Nigeria, Kenya, Gambia, Uganda, and Pakistan, where we already have safe houses for lesbians and trans people. Let's have a look. What else we got? We want to continue to develop a partnership in Costa Rica to shelter marginalised populations and reintegrate them into society. And we want to expand outreach and develop small groups that offer support in China, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And if it sounds like a list, it's because I wrote to Reverend Pat and said, I know what's going on. And she wrote back and she said, this is some of it, well, let's do it. I'm like, yeah. So there's a lot more going on besides this, which is why we take an annual collection around Easter time. It is the way that this work is funded, and every penny that we give makes a huge difference. And this work is important to me, not just because I know a number of people on the team, like Reverend Pat and Reverend Boone, who go to these extraordinary places and literally risk life and limb to make a difference, but because of my own story. You probably know my story about how I became homeless. Everyone knows that I was a Jehovah's Witness and that they threw me out. I lost my family, my friends, my job, my home, everything. But when I look back, I can see that God's hand was with me through that process. I believe that God was with me in the Samaritan volunteer who broke the rules and called me back in the phone box when my money ran out. I believe that God was with me in the form of the Cyrenian volunteer in Bradford that gave me a sofa to sleep on whilst I found my feet. I believe that God was with me in the guy who gave me a job at the casino and never asked my age. God was with me with Liz, who taught me that unconditional love does not mean behaviour without boundaries. Nobody had known from the past would help me. Now, I'm sure God could have worked through any one of them, but the reality was that if God did speak to the heart of some of them, that none of them listened. They had their rules, they had their community, they had their belief, and I was on the outside of it all. I was no longer one of them, and so I was considered dangerous. So imagine for a moment it hadn't been a cult that had judged me and cast me out. Imagine now what it would have been like if it had been my country. I mean, where would I go? What would I do? Would I try to get away and make a new life as a refugee, perhaps? I mean, the loss is total and the grief is immense. Now, in my case, God found people who listened to their hearts and helped me. But what would have happened if I'd been in a place where nobody would listen? What if every plea God made to a heart was overruled by fear and ignorance? Where would God go then? Where would the angels go to find the hearts that understand what it's like to be rejected for who you are and then suffer terribly because of it? Where else but here? Why is it that the majority of people who raise money for cancer research have lost somebody to cancer? Why is it that so many people that campaign for assisted dying have watched somebody that they love suffer terribly waiting for the end of life? Why is it that so many of those who work with the abused were themselves abused? Because they're only thinking of themselves? No, because they've experienced the specifics of such terrible things and want to prevent anyone else from suffering the same. I want to help because I understand what it is that you're going through. Now, I believe that we're called to serve the LGBT community, and I don't think that our focus should be a grand church with stained glass. I don't believe it should be growing the size of our membership, although I hope that everyone who walks through the door feels welcome. I don't even believe it should be a specific Christian theology or dogma. I believe that Jesus has called us to serve the LGBT community because we know what it's like to suffer, either because we identify as LGBT or we love somebody who does. We understand. We know in a way that someone who hasn't experienced what we have experienced does not. Someone might understand that the situation in Libya is desperately unfair. They might even lobby and work for change there. Goodness, I hope they are. But we understand what it is to feel rejected because of our sexuality or our gender expression. We've either experienced it ourselves or we've been through it with someone that we love. Why do you think God led us here? And halfway around the world, somebody that we may never meet is desperate. Right now, there are LGBT Christians meeting in Cairo that we support, being so careful that nobody finds out because they'd certainly be imprisoned and tortured. I remember what it was like to have a secret that I believed I could never share. How I wish I'd met all of you and that you could have reached out to me. In today's scripture reading, we meet a Peter who's very different to the Peter that we meet in the Gospels. This man is not about to deny Jesus. This man isn't unsure of his message or who he is, or of God's plan. This man is really self-assured. Why? What's the change? Because suddenly, I think Peter gets it. After suffering in the crucible of guilt and shame, he understands that he needs to speak out and he doesn't mince his words. Talk about a hue and cry. Peter certainly causes one with his speech. All he's done is dare to speak the truth out loud. This person, he says, that you rejected is the beloved of God. This person that you killed, he said, is life itself. This person, he says, that you counted as worthless is the cornerstone of creation. Look at yourselves, he's saying. It's the human cry. Those who do the work of the Global Justice Institute are the spearhead. But we are the shaft of the spear. We are its weight and its force and its power. The money we give, the prayers that we lift, the voice that we use, we are the ones that have said yes to God when so many people have said no. We are the ones that heard God calling in the night and said, "Here I am, use me." We are the hands and feet of Jesus, the living Christ. And when we hear the voice in the wilderness, we recognize its cry. We understand its plea. We know the truth of it. And in our heart, we hear God ask us to respond to it. Our vision is for a world where LGBTQ people live free from discrimination. We believe that we are called primarily to empower and serve the LGBT community. Our core values state that, as commanded in Micah 6:8, we are a Christian church called to do justice. To do justice and walk humbly with God. We seek at all times to be honest, transparent, and true to our mission in the world. Our support for the Global Justice Institute is an expression of who we are. So I ask, please, that you give generously. Now, if you're watching this online, then I invite you to go to theglobaljusticeinstitute.com and click on the donate button. If you have a PayPal account, it's really easy to give, and you can target your gift to a specific work in a specific country, or you can donate in memory of someone that you love. And every single penny makes a difference. The offering that we take now is for the Global Justice Institute, and then we'll take a normal collection at the end of the service.